Hello, welcome once again to the Acoustic Words Reading Room. I'm Stephen Larson. We have a bit of a longer story tonight, so I'll get right to it. This is from the psychological fiction section, and it is called The Wisdom of Solomon. Nothing exists. All is a dream. God, man, the world, the sun, the moon, the wilderness of stars, a dream, all a dream. They have no existence. Nothing exists save empty space, and you. And you are not you. You have no body, no blood, no bones. Mark Twain, The Mysterious Stranger. Solomon Perry entered the world in the early 1950s, destined for failure. To begin with, his father was disgusted with his name. "That's a stupid name," he argued. "Nonsense," his wife snorted. "Solomon was the smartest man in history." "It's a sissy name," he insisted, "and no son of mine is going to be called it." Then she got mad, and since she could be a real bitch when she put her mind to it, he gave in. But he never expected much of the kid, and little Solomon, like most sons, didn't want to disappoint his daddy. Solomon's mother, though she had stood up for him, became disenchanted with her new toy when she realized the diapers and the crying were not going to go away. Eventually, she resigned herself to her new role, but she was careful to keep Solomon their only child. Solomon's parents both believed, if not in love, at least in discipline, and he grew up in fear of pain. This came to include sports, and he was soon the clumsiest kid in the neighborhood. Naturally slender, his lack of athleticism had little other physical effect on him. However, he became an easy target for local bullies, and he learned to avoid conflict, accepting loneliness as the price for safety. With no refuge inside his home, and no reason to go outside, it was little wonder that Solomon turned to books for companionship and solace. Science fiction and fantasy were his earliest escapes, and his collection of comic books became legendary. But his tastes became cosmopolitan, and his shelves a literary United Nations. Dickens rubbed shoulders with Dostoevsky, Milne and Milton and Melville kept company, and Heinlein and Hesse and Haggard and Hawthorne sang happily discordant harmonies. Given a choice, Solomon would have remained solitary and invisible, but this choice was taken from him in high school when the girls who had once scorned him suddenly saw him differently. He was painfully shy, a fact of which he was all too aware, but he had also become startlingly handsome, a concept which had never dared enter his mind. This was an irresistible combination. He was now drawn into conversations with the girls in his classes, conversations which, for the most part, he didn't initiate. These revealed an intellectual depth which furthered his mystique. More and more his fellow students, of both sexes now, turned to him for information, for advice, for a shoulder to cry on. He craved the attention and encouraged it by listening eagerly. It was inevitable that Solomon would begin dating. It was also inevitable that his first date would be a disaster. It was a school dance. He had the day right, and originally had the time right, too. She lived in an apartment within walking distance of the school, so his father dropped him off at the address Solomon had written down. But after staring at the huge, old, ivy-covered structure for a few minutes, he decided it looked more like a grade school, and he'd gotten the address wrong. He started walking, looking for the right place. A cold and frantic hour later, he found a payphone, only to discover he had no change. He might have stood there all night if someone hadn't called the phone booth by mistake. With the help of that cooperative wrong number, he was soon talking to his erstwhile date, who informed him that the grade school really was their building. After that, he was certain that the evening couldn't possibly get worse, even though the corsage he'd brought clashed with her dress, and he didn't know how to dance. The evening wasn't a total loss. She had a great sense of humor, and though they never went out again, they remained friends. She introduced him to her own passion, drama. He'd read many plays, but never considered acting. So he was pleasantly surprised when, on his first audition for a school play, at her urging, he was given a part. Granted, it was small, Officer Brophy and arsenic and old lace, but it was the first time he'd ever been accepted for anything. He threw all his heart and gratitude into his performance and was rewarded with the part of the gentleman caller in the Glass Menagerie. He had found his niche. During his next 3 years, Solomon's popularity grew. Of course, some might say that the only way to go from nothing is up, but Solomon had not yet learned to be cynical. He was still known primarily as a brain, but acting was beginning to give him self-assurance. His dates were still nothing exciting, but at least they occurred a little more frequently now, and nothing truly disastrous happened during them. Solomon had long been aware of romance novels, but had disdained them. Now that he was beginning to dabble in that world himself, however, they became his secret mistresses. Their clandestine rendezvous took place late at night in his room in the dim light of a small bedside lamp, soon becoming guilty pleasures. After a while, he turned to the novels of Henry Miller and Irwin Shaw, and from them to soft-core pornography. He read these in fear and trembling, not only at what he was learning, but also at the possibility of parental discovery. He didn't know it, but he'd already been found out. His mother's reaction was predictable: hysterics, self-recriminations, and a vow to destroy every filthy book in his room. His father's reaction was totally unexpected. In a rare show of paternal pride, he defended his son. Maybe, he said, the kid's not going to grow up queer after all. His refusal to back down put a new strain on their marriage, but by now he was used to that. Solomon's senior year in high school was, he decided, the best time of his entire life. He had a steady girlfriend, people to whom he could talk, and a triumph as Willie Loman in the spring play, Death of a Salesman. And he'd been accepted at a major West Coast university with a nationally respected theater department. But his feeling of greatest success came that May when he broke up with his girlfriend. Until then, it had always been the other way around. He arrived at college the first day of fall semester 1970 with his favorite books, his limited wardrobe, and a fresh supply of fearful uncertainty. He had just begun to feel accepted in high school, and this new environment was devastating. He spent his first week hiding in his dorm room, wondering what a little twerp from the Midwest was doing in the western mecca of all would-be actors. However, his good sense and a volume of Hemingway soon convinced him that if he wanted to survive, he must seize control of his own life. And where better than here, where no one knew him and he could build his own persona. So began Solomon's greatest acting challenge. He forced himself to lose his shyness and imitate the popular people. He wore the right clothes, listened to the right music, and frequented the right hangouts. He went out when he wanted to stay in, sought the crowd when he wanted to be alone, and sat up half the night telling lies about his sexual conquests and drinking prowess when all he wanted to do was lie in bed and read a book. And in time, his performance convinced even himself. He got properly drunk at parties and vomited with the best of them, graduated from softcore porn to the most explicit material he could find, and experimented with much of what he read. He gorged himself on pleasure and popularity and the approval of those he counted as his friends. And he hated every minute of it. His freshman year ended with a plummeting grade point average, a manic interpretation of King Lear, and a deliberate overdose. As with almost everything else, he botched his own suicide. However, during his recovery, he turned to philosophy, desperately devouring the works of the world's deepest thinkers. He journeyed with the likes of Plato and Socrates and Bertrand Russell, and made side trips into the jungles of such less conventional minds as Carlos Castanedas and Robert M. Pirsig. He was utterly fascinated, and when he was released in time to sign up for sophomore year, he changed his major to philosophy, much to the relief of the dean of the theater department, who still had nightmares of King Lear reciting Hamlet's soliloquy to a very confused Cordelia. When classes resumed, Solomon Perry changed more than his major. He changed his entire lifestyle to that of a near ascetic. His private library of pornography, which had achieved a status once enjoyed by his comic book collection, was donated to a properly awestruck freshman. Parties became duller by the loss of his inebriated antics, and his relationships with co-eds took an intellectual turn, with only an occasional digression to satisfy the appetites of the flesh. His grade point average reversed its downward spiral virtually overnight. His parents, who had viewed his dissipation with disfavor, and at a distance, refusing to visit him even in his convalescence, were relieved with this sudden outburst of common sense. He coldly maintained that their opinions were entirely immaterial, but deep inside, something was pleased that he'd finally made Mommy and Daddy happy. Another year passed. Spring 1972 approached, and with it, discontent. Solomon realized that for all his knowledge and experimentation, his life was a shell in which his intellect rattled like a dried pea. The philosophers, he saw, were searching for an elusive something that would justify their existence, and even those who claimed to have all the answers had, at best, only clues. Solomon was left with an acute sense of frustration, which crystallized into a firm resolve. If he couldn't find what he sought in the souls of others, he would have to find it in his own. But where to begin? The answer eluded him for weeks. A year of philosophy told him that it would not be found in the intellect, and he'd been to the outskirts of the chemically induced utopias advocated by some of the contemporary sages and found them to be little more than slums. But it wasn't until just before final exams that an unlikely door was opened. He was reading about one of his favorite science fiction authors, L. Ron Hubbard, when he was reminded that Hubbard had founded his own religion. He had ignored that revelation before, but now he was curious. A quick study of the doctrines of Scientology convinced him that Hubbard had missed the answer too, but the realm of the spiritual and mystical became an attractive idea. So, as soon as his exams were over, Solomon turned to religion. Orthodox Christianity he rejected immediately. His parents had insisted on the traditional church training, and his observations of the workings of the church had left him unimpressed. He'd perceived it all as hypocrisies and empty words, wonderful in theory, but impossible in practice. He agreed with Nietzsche that, in truth, there was only one Christian, and he died on the cross. Besides, something in him resented a religion that could inspire a woman to name her child Solomon. He barely glanced at Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and the like, for he was soon convinced that their teachings were also marvelous, but impractical. This took him through the summer, when he had to decide whether to continue in philosophy during his third year. He chose to quit school altogether. His parents were furious, his mother demanding why she deserved such treatment, and his father making dark and dire predictions of future failures, threatening to cut him off financially. Solomon had long ago learned to ignore them. He cut the purse strings himself by taking a job in a hole-in-the-wall bookstore that specialized in little-known volumes on arcane subjects. It wasn't much, but it kept him fed on Hamburger Helper in a tiny efficiency apartment while giving him access to texts on dozens of offbeat religions. During the next months, Solomon spent every spare minute assimilating every bit of knowledge he could find. If he wasn't satisfied with what he read, he sought it personally. He attended Baha'i firesides and Unification Church weekend retreats. He haunted services by Mormons and Christian Scientists and Jehovah's Witnesses and Unitarians, carrying away all their literature. He participated in seminars on transcendental meditation and est and spiritualism and the way, and hitchhiked hundreds of miles to hear Moses David, and the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, and David Spangler. And after more than a year of intensive research, he firmly concluded that none of them knew what the hell they were talking about. This was stimulating and dismaying. Dismaying because his study had seemingly gone for nothing. Stimulating because if he were to find an answer, he would have to do it on his own. He cast about for some way to begin, and once again, his beloved science fiction provided the path. In Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, hybrid Martian Valentine Michael Smith had concocted his own religion based on the premise, "Thou art God." Through earlier readings, Solomon had smiled indulgently. The idea of every living being God had seemed so naive, but now he gave it some serious thought. The same concept was the basis for pantheism, his favorite theology. And it really wasn't too far removed from that most exemplary of all Christians, Jesus of Nazareth, who had said, if he remembered correctly, "The kingdom of God is within you, and God and I are one." The more he thought about it, the more intrigued Solomon became. It was crazy, to be sure, but no crazier than many of the other ideas he'd studied, and it was rather appealing. He played with it for several days before he reluctantly abandoned it. After all, if he was God, or even a godling, he should have some control over his own existence, shouldn't he? At least he should be able to work a miracle or two. And yet, the only real miracle in his miserable life was that he'd managed to stay alive and sane so far. Now he plunged into a black mood that nothing, not his religious studies, not his philosophy, not even his science fiction, could shatter. He prowled the darkened streets, existing on an hour or two of tortured sleep. He conducted ever more bizarre sexual experiments in an effort to recapture a sense of excitement, relying on a bewildering variety of drugs to keep him going. And, finally, something snapped. At 3 o'clock on a wet, chill spring morning, Solomon stood swaying in the center of a murkily lit room, staring at the bodies writhing in the wreckage of his 21st birthday party, feeling disgust rise like nausea. A naked stranger was stripping him of his own clothes. Without thinking, Solomon planted his fist in the center of the guy's leer. He ignored the explosion of blood and teeth, the bodies he kicked at, the screams of pain, the angry shouts, the fingernails that clawed at him as he fought his way to the door and out onto the street. He ran without caring where he went, ran until he could run no more, and then collapsed, sobbing and retching. He awoke at mid-afternoon in a refuse-choked alley. His head whirled and ached, the knuckles of his hand were stiff and swollen, and the blood-caked scratches on his face and arms throbbed and stung. He tried to stand, but the effort made him sick again. So he lay in his own vomit, trying desperately to cling to something of hope. As he stared at the harsh, blue-gray sky, a tiny voice began yammering in his ear. "I think, therefore I am," it burbled. This is a hell of a time to think of Descartes, he chided himself, but the voice ignored his rebuke. "I think, therefore I am," it tittered. "I think, therefore I am. I 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 think, therefore I am." "Shut up!" he screamed, and "shut up!" screamed the echoes. A cloud of pigeons roiled the air with startled wings. "I think," whispered the voice, "therefore I am." Battling the pain and sickness, he dragged himself to his feet and staggered out of the alley, supporting himself against the wall. The street was busy, and the sidewalks filled with beautiful people who glared at his torn, befouled clothing and haggard, filthy visage, and wrinkled their noses as they veered around him. He saw none of them. He wanted only a quiet place where he could die in peace, or at least where he could escape from that voice which giggled incessantly at his shoulder. "I think, therefore I am." He fought another wave of nausea, leaning his head against a cool pane of glass. The illness receded as he stared into peaceful darkness. He ached to enter and lose himself in solitude, and it was nearly 2 full minutes before he noticed the window display. A pile of books was scattered in an artistically haphazard fashion. A Bible was there, and several doctrinal books of the Church of Christ Scientist. He dimly remembered reading these books not so long ago. One of them, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, lay open atop the pile, a passage highlighted in fluorescent yellow. He read a few words before he had to turn his tortured eyes away from the color, but the rest of the passage crept into his memory. There is no matter in life, and no life in matter, no matter in good, and no good in matter. The verity of mind shows conclusively how it is that matter seems to be, but is not. Matter has no life, hence it has no real existence. "I think, therefore I am!" cried the voice in triumph. And in that instant René Descartes had met and wooed and wed with Mary Baker Eddy. Solomon fell to his knees, gritting his teeth and clutching at his head. He had to get away, find somewhere to hide and think. He staggered away from the Christian Science reading room and back to the alley, where he collapsed in the rancid garbage behind an overflowing dumpster. Something had happened, something important. If he could only stop the pounding in his head for a moment, maybe— "Thou art God!" The voice reverberated from the looming walls, crashed against his skull, battered his numbed brain. "Thou art God!" "Who are you?" he screamed, clutching his exploding head. "What do you want?" "Thou art God!" the voice roared. It was his own voice, but he wasn't speaking. "Thou thinkest, therefore thou art. Matter is evil. Evil does not exist. Matter does not exist. The kingdom of God is within thee. Thou art God. Thou ridest the winds of eternity. Thy mind hath created all that thou seest. Thou art insane. Thou art God." The echoes died away. Solomon let out a weak, pitiful kitten cry of terror. Then he fainted. When he woke, the sky was dark and his mind was clear. He was still very weak, but he was able to stand without the world reeling. He remembered something about an insane God, but it was all a jumble until he heard his voice whisper in the dark, "Thou art God." Then he recalled the booming message. It had seemed foolish and confused, but that was because he too had been confused. Now his mind was sharper than ever, and the words had a crystalline clarity. He looked up, and they were written across the sky in huge, glittering letters. He quickly lowered his eyes, embarrassed, hoping no one else would notice. With great dignity, "Thou art God," the voice murmured. He straightened his torn, fouled clothes and stepped, with only the slightest unsteadiness, out of the alley. He was aware that he stank, but he didn't care. He now had a purpose and needed only a place to fulfill it. He walked all night, leaving the city and climbing the rugged, wooded hills. The moon, no longer hidden by the smog, lit his path with a glorious light. Once he looked up at the stars that beckoned so temptingly. "That's where you belong," urged the whisper. "You must return there." But he became so dizzy that he kept his eyes to the ground from then on. Dawn found him seated in lotus position atop a high cliff, staring out over the ocean. He had spent the last hour or so piecing together everything. It had been almost childishly simple with his new clarity of mind. That he was alone in the universe was certain. Nothing else existed but him, not even his body. "Mind is all," whispered the voice. "Matter doesn't exist." He, his mind, had been extant for all eternity. But at some point he had become bored, and for amusement had created a world in his imagination. He had done his work too well. He had created too believable a world, and had become lost in it. He had gone mad, and in his madness had created things with which to torture himself, pain and embarrassment, and people like his teachers and his schoolmates and his parents. Yet through it all, some part of his mind was trying to regain control, leaving hints about the truth in the books he'd read, working toward this moment. All that remained was to complete the transition. The sun peeped over the trees behind him, and Solomon fixed his eyes on the distant sea horizon. He began to quietly drone the mantra he had been given during his flirtation with transcendental meditation, turning his thoughts inward. "The kingdom of God is within you," assured the whisper. "Thou art God." He felt a strange new power and closed his eyes. One by one, he felt the shackles of insanity slip from him. He opened his eyes and looked down at the sea, finally recognizing it as a bit of his imagination over which he had control. He smiled. "Cease," he murmured. "Be still." And the waves froze. Solomon scrambled to his feet, staring. It was working. He was gaining control. He laughed at the motionless gulls anchored against the sapphire water, then whirled and pointed at the sun and cried, "Go down!" And in an instant, it was sinking behind the forest. "Halt!" he cried, and it stopped. "Now, rise!" And it rose again as he shouted in triumph and exhilaration. "Are you all right?" the voice behind him asked. Solomon slowly turned and found a young couple in hiking clothes, staring at him with concern. He smiled benignly at them. "Listen," the young man continued solicitously. "You're not looking so hot. Come with us. We'll get you to a doctor." Solomon laughed. You can't fool me anymore," he assured them. "I'm remembering. You look real enough, but I know better. You don't exist." The girl tugged at her companion's sleeve. "Let's go," she whispered. "The guy's crazy." Solomon laughed again. "That won't work. I know the truth now. You can't hold me by confusing me. Sure, I was crazy, but I'm not going to be soon." The couple started backing away. Listen," the young man said quickly. "You just wait here. We'll send help." Solomon cut him off. "Help?" he chortled. "Oh, I don't need help, especially from my own phantoms. Here," he pointed at them. "You don't exist, you know, so be gone." He snapped his fingers. "Now!" They dissolved into a million sparkling particles that floated away on the breeze. Solomon laughed again. It was so easy, so wonderfully easy, now that he knew the truth. He spread his arms wide and stared up into the rich blue depths of the sky. "They weren't real," he whispered. "They weren't real at all. Nothing is real. Nothing but me." He felt suddenly lightheaded, quickly lowered his eyes, and gasped in joyful surprise. He had left the ground and was rising straight up. The cliff top, the forest, the frozen sea, all were rapidly dwindling beneath his toes. He cried out in delight. There was the city, wrapped in a caterpillar, like a caterpillar in its cocoon of smog. There were the mountains to the east and the desert beyond. There was the entire coast beneath him, from Mexico to Canada, and still he rose until the opposite ocean slipped up over the eastern edge of the world beneath the clouds. He knew none of it was real, but for the moment he reveled in the brilliance of his own creation. All of North America was shrinking beneath him. South America joined it, and the poles, and now the whole world of his imagination. He flashed by the moon, giving it hardly a glance as it too receded. And then everything slowed and stopped, and he hung in space, looking around. The stars were more intense than he had ever seen them. The nearer planets were tiny, softly mottled disks. And the sun! He squinted. It was so bright! He frowned at it, and it dimmed. He nodded and reached out with thumb and forefinger and snuffed out the sun like a candle. Then he waved his hand nonchalantly, and the stars and planets winked out of existence. He turned back to the earth. It glowed sullenly, refusing to be banished. He contemplated it. It had been his most delicate and beloved creation, but it had gone so wrong. His every pain and humiliation had been suffered there. It was a special place that should be treated specially. He focused on it, and it brightened, glowing from within. The oceans began to boil, obscuring the continents with vast clouds of steam. The light increased, and the entire planet wavered and blurred. A hissing tendril reached out, wrapped itself lovingly around the moon, and drew the cold rock to its fiery breast. The earth became another sun, and then began to fade. White melting to yellow, and then gold, and then orange and red, and finally a filmy magenta that drifted apart and disappeared. And now Solomon was left in complete darkness, with only the beating of his heart and the rasping of his breath. He smiled. His body, too, was an illusion, to be disposed of with the others if he was to complete his self-cure. Slowly and carefully, he obliterated his toes and then worked his way upward until nothing remained but his mind, floating serenely in the eternal void. They found him where the two hikers had said they'd left him. He was standing, motionless, arms dangling at his sides, head cocked slightly, lips curved in a gentle smile, eyes staring vacantly at the sky. He responded to nothing, and they had to carry him back to the city. They eventually identified him and found his parents. Their reactions when notified were like the chorus of an old song. His mother wailed, "How could he do this to me?" His father merely snorted, "I always knew he was nuts." The doctors couched their own diagnosis in obscure Latin and gave little hope for recovery. His parents had him transferred to a cheap, minimal care facility. They mailed their check regularly, but never visited. "Our son?" they replied when asked. "He died long ago." Solomon was content. He hovered in blessed darkness as he had once hovered eons ago. He had been insane, but he was all right now. The tortures of that false world were behind him. Of course, he would eventually grow weary of nothing as he had before, and would once again create an imaginary world for himself. This time, he would be more careful, and create a place without the terrors of the last one. But that was in the future yet, the far, far future. Now, he was looking forward to a couple of millennia of rest. If he'd had lungs, he would have sighed. If he'd had lips, he would have smiled. Solomon Perry had found peace. That was The Wisdom of Solomon. Please visit StephenMLarson.com if you'd like more information on how to get a hold of electronic, digital, or hard copy versions of any of these stories, poems. Look at the About tab on this page to get more information. And leave a like, a comment, subscribe, share, and be sure to come back again to the Acoustic Words Reading Room. Thank you. Have a good night.